Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zubko. Today we're going to speak about an interesting topic related to economy, to climate change, but also to special movement which is going on through the audience, through students, through societies worldwide. And that's what sort of economy do we want? And how can we connect this economy to climate change processes, to Green Deal, to renewable energies, and to other things related to this movement? My guest today is Dr. Patrick Schröder. Hello.
Hello, Martin. Nice to meet you. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to join the show.
Dr. Patrick Schröder is a Senior Research Fellow in Environment and Society Center at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, or as we say, the Chatham House. He focuses on the global transition to an inclusive circular economy with a focus on international policy coordination, closing the investment gap, the role of global trade, and the contribution of the circular economy to the Sustainable Development Goals. So circular economy might be the answer, but what does it mean? How can we understand the circular economy? And these are the questions for Patrick for today. So let's briefly explain, based on your experience, Patrick, what are the principles of circular economy? Sometimes we don't know, what exactly does it mean, circular economy? Is it just about waste management? Is it about renewing, repairing? So let's clarify these things. And then we can maybe clarify how the world understands circular economy today.
Yes, these are good questions and actually not that easy to answer. But before I start, maybe first of all, to mention, it's actually good that you're bringing this topic into the international relations, into the podcast that you have, because initially, circular economy is often looked at as an environmental issue, and it hasn't been looked at much in the international relations context. But it has a lot of implications, and we are actually still beginning to see how, for example, international political economy, issues around global trade, but also industrial policies that countries are implementing are all related to the circular economy. So it's an emerging field, and yeah, the question that you ask, so what actually is it, is quite important, and there are many definitions about it, and that might cause also the confusion. But I think I always try to start actually explaining of what it isn't, and much of the current economic system or the consumption production systems that we have, they're very what we say, they're linear, so like take, make, waste approach. So a lot of resources are extracted, then they're processed, manufactured, and then there's the retail, the consumption side, and at the end we're generating a lot of waste. So most of the material flows in the current economy are linear, and circularity, as you said, is it waste management? It's the entry point is often waste, but it's more than that. So it's really about thinking, how can we keep the value of materials and products and components in the system for longer. So it's not only about reducing the environmental impact of waste, but so how do you shift that also in terms of the value that we're losing? Because we know, for example, if we look at critical raw materials from, for example, electronic waste. On the one hand, electronic waste is creating like a toxic legacy, but at the same time, we're losing a lot of value. So one of the issues here is that the current economic design or industrial design paradigm is often what we say based on planned obsolescence. So a lot of the products that are designed are not built to last. or they're not designed to be repairable, etc. So that creates a lot of unnecessary material throughput, and it's very wasteful. So any strategy, any approach that changes that, to either kind of like maintain product lifetimes, strategies to recover components, etc., all of that is part of circularity. So, I mean, one reason also why the definition is maybe quite broad, or why we have several definitions, is because it's in an evolving paradigm. So it's, I think most people get the idea of what it is. And we know from the past, a lot of things were more circular then. A lot of also practices were more circular. And most people understand what we need to do. So there are already many pockets, actually, of circularity. So every time you go and repair something, that's a circular economy activity. If you put bottles into a recycling bin, that's part of circularity. But it also works on other levels. For example, the international shipping industry works with circular economy because all these big containers, they're being reused many times. It's not just that they're being used once and then discarded. So every time you rent something, that's also part of circular economy. And so the challenge is, how do we expand that into other economic areas where we don't have, basically where we're losing the value, where we're creating waste, where there's inefficiencies, etc.
And can we qualify, or can we define what is the main goal of this economy? Like, we have a system, as you said, there are parts in that system, but where are we aiming? Like what is our goal? When maybe, let's say you have a country like Great Britain, and you can say this country is based on circular economy because, and this because is what?
That's a very good question, but it probably depends who you ask. What's the goal? So for environmentalists, obviously the goal is to reduce escalating resource consumption levels, to reduce environmental impacts, to like arrive at a system that is close to zero waste, and also to mitigate, for example, climate change. Because again, so all the materials we use are directly also related to climate change issues, based on, for example, the latest global resources outlook that was published earlier this year by the International Resource Panel. What's said in there, about 55% of global emissions are associated with resource extraction, manufacturing, etc., etc. So there's this direct link. So that's from maybe from the environmentalist perspective. So it's an approach to address triple planetary crisis of climate, waste, and pollution and biodiversity loss. But then if you, for example, if you ask maybe representatives of the business sector, they would say, oh, the objective of the circular economy is to capture value from waste, right? As I said before, so to recover the value that we otherwise lose, and there are opportunities to develop new business models, etc. If you maybe speak to maybe more macroeconomists, or even politicians who say, well, for us, the circular economy is maybe a strategy to achieve strategic autonomy, maybe, to use a term that's also being used in Europe. So maybe it's a strategy to achieve resource security, because we know there are, especially in times of geopolitical tensions, supply chains have become more vulnerable. It might be a strategy to achieve more economic resilience or economic security. So there are kind of like different objectives that people are pursuing through circular economy.
Right.
And that makes it also politically interesting, because depending on the political context, circular economy can achieve different objectives.
Right. What about when we have that sort of more holistic perspective, and that's international relations, international economic frameworks? So, how can we modify them, or what do we need to do in order that the circular economy is going to be the main component of this framework? And the second question, do we want circular economy to be that component? Do we have capabilities? Do we have resources to pursue that vision?
Yes, so yeah, we definitely want the circular economy to be a key component, or even at the center of kind of the economic transformation, or let's say the transformation to a sustainable economic system. And this relates to questions that we're working or that I've been working on as well. So how do we can use the circular economy, for example, to support the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals? How do we achieve circularity also to not only achieve environmental objectives, but also how does it contribute to human development? Especially, we're also looking at how does it contribute to economic or sustainable economic development and growth in countries in the global south. So that's where we've been saying we need an inclusive approach, an inclusive circular economy, which is built on cooperation between countries rather than competition. So for a circular economy that's inclusive, we've been highlighting the need also to look at international trade frameworks, but also international development cooperation, also development finance. So these are all key aspects that need to be addressed. So, for example, in terms of trade, one thing that we're seeing at the moment is that there's still a lot of waste dumping. So from industrialized countries to lower middle income countries. So that's in a way a system. There's a lot of criminal activity, obviously, but the trade system is currently not fit for circular materials or circular materials that are shipped across borders. So there are many. So the challenge is to make this transparent and traceable, so that basically we can track how materials flow across borders. At the moment, there are many barriers, including different standards, different procedures, like the Harmonized Systems Code is currently not fit to distinguish between different types of secondary materials or waste products. So this international trade system currently doesn't really enable a global circular economy. So there's a lot of room or a lot of need to improve that. I mean, issues around finance, you asked, do we have the resources? So finance, generally climate finance this is increasing. Circular financing circularity is still trickier. It's an emerging field in finance. We also here need to develop new criteria, how to invest into these often kind of innovative business models that have different types of value propositions. Often these are considered still to be high risk investments, so they're not so attractive for private investors. That's why, for example, also multilateral development banks have a role to play to co-finance some of these things. But it also links to questions around how do you assess risk of investments. So we've also been trying to work on issues. So how do you assess, for example, the linear risk of different types of models? So going forward, that's a lot that needs to be done in terms of methodologies that used by financial sector. I stop here. So it's not only about because you ask about economic system, and so trade and finance obviously key aspects of that. In addition, obviously, then it comes to questions around markets and pricing. At the moment, we see a lot of the primary materials that are extracted, they're still cheaper than, for example, the secondary or recycled materials. Plastics is one example, which is obviously a real barrier towards increasing recycled content. One reason why a lot of primary materials are cheaper is that there are subsidies going into many extractive sectors, including fossil fuels. So some of these issues need to be addressed to enable more circularity.
And Patrick, do we have any international authority or institution that is basically publishing those standards? Because as you said, there are certain methodology standards, criterion about circular economy, but where can I find them?
Yes, this is all work in progress. So international standards are actually currently, they're being developed by ISO, the International Standards Organization. There's been a process in place over the last few years. There's a technical working group, so I think it's TC323, that has been convening, and actually in May, I think later this month, in a couple of weeks or so, they will publish a first set of standards on circular economy. So these will be standards on organizational practices. It will include also definitions. It will also include standards on product design. So which is a first attempt really to have this international kind of like standard, which obviously is not mandatory, right? There's no legislation yet, but countries might then adopt those standards and definitions, include this into national policies, etc., etc. On trade, for example, at the WTO, that there's things developing, but it's very slow. I mean, the overall issues that we know WTO is suffering from is relevant also to having, and anything there is taking a very long time, and there's a lot of politics involved. But I think some topics are progressing faster when it comes, for example, to plastics. There are different working groups looking at plastics within the WTO, which is linked also to ongoing plastics treaty negotiations. So at the UNEA 5.2 that convened last year in Nairobi, there was a resolution, and that gave the United Nations Environment Programme the mandate to start negotiations on a global plastics treaty. That's been underway since then, and there's the expectation to have a legally binding agreement negotiated by end of this year. And that will then have implications for a whole range of things in terms of plastics manufacturing, but also the waste management. The treaty wants to, or has the ambition to, regulate across the whole life cycle of plastics, which means also upstream petrochemicals production, and this will then have other impacts also on trade and pricing, etc., etc. But overall, there's a lack of multilateral institutions guiding this transition. So we see a lot of countries developing national action plans or national roadmaps on circular economy, but these are not connected on anything on the international level. So there's quite a gap, which is, from our perspective, is quite problematic. because it needs to have a global coordination. Why we need this global coordination is exactly some of the reasons that I tried to outline before about this inclusiveness approach. So if countries pursue this as a way of competing economically, obviously the industrialized countries with more financial resources and technological capacities, they will be the winners in this race, whereas then the low and middle income countries probably going to lose out because they're not being able to attract the investments. They're not able to keep up with issues around data and traceability of products. They probably then also lose market access. For example, if industrialized countries come up with new product standards that need to be fulfilled, especially smaller countries and suppliers might not have the capacity to provide these kind of circular products, etc. And yeah, so that's again, international coordination is needed to not to widen this gap that we already see in the linear system. So that's why we're also trying to say, as we are basically transforming the economy from like the material economy from a linear to circular system, we can where we basically say we want to design out waste. How at the same time, because it is very disruptive, at the same time we should also try to design out existing inequalities of the linear system.
Absolutely. And also, as I said before the interview, it's not that easy to find a special centers, dealing with circular economy. I'm very happy that Chatham House has one. And this is also, I think, sort of like a research gap for international relations scholars to work interdisciplinary, with the people from the economy or political economy or different trade disciplines, to develop something. Because, as I said, it's something that people speak about, but when you want something specific, documents, regulations, methodology, not that easy to find, Believe me, I put some effort into this, and this is sort of something I would recommend to reconsider for scholars, because I think it's quite interesting area for research. Let's go to one level down to bilateral. So, for instance, when you have two countries and they have trade agreements, is it possible, or is there any political will to implement elements of circular economy into these agreements, or can they be modified to include the circular economy elements?
Yes, that I think so. So it might be even easier to do this bilaterally between countries that have existing trade. As I mentioned before, the WTO is very complex, so any changes on that level take time. But countries that have bilateral trade agreements can have specific provisions for circular trade, and this already exists. I think don't know actually too many details, but so for a lot of trade agreements, the United States have specific provisions about remanufacturing. So remanufacturing is a high value kind of economic activity for like expensive equipment, so capital intensive equipment, but also, for example, the company Caterpillar, which has a lot of big machinery, is one of the leaders in remanufacturing many of the components, and they are shipping these back and forth internationally to be able to take old components and then remanufacture them back to have the previous functionalities. So some of these things are included in trade agreements, but other, for example, areas are medical devices. They're also expensive and remanufacturing makes sense for these. It's an economic case, and that also requires international trade. So that's something. I mean, a specific area that we're looking at now is the textile industry and textile value chains. So at the moment, what's happening is that the EU has been developing a circular textile strategy with a range of policies that will come into place over the next few years, including not new requirements on product design, but also issues around data traceability requirements. There's also a ban that's coming in place on the banning the destruction of unsold products, which is hugely wasteful, but which has been common practice in the fashion industry. So these changes will have implications, obviously, for garment manufacturers, especially countries producing ready-made garments. And we've been working with Bangladesh, for example, on this to understand how will these upcoming EU policies impact Bangladesh manufacturing sector. And it's the biggest sector of the country. So any changes have, or any disruptions have implications on exports, but also employment. So what we're trying to understand is, because Bangladesh currently enjoys the everything but arms agreement. That means it's a preferential trade agreement with Europe. Providing easy access to the European market. How Bangladesh will graduate into the low middle income country status, I think by 2027 or 28 in a few years' time. And then this everything but arms agreement will not apply anymore. So then I think, and that's already underway, Europe and Bangladesh will need to renegotiate a trade agreement. And what we're trying to maybe put forward is that circular textiles, so textiles with recycled content, or textiles that have a more durable design, could have preferential access to the European market. Maybe tariff-free access, but whereas less sustainable or less circular products would then face a tariff. So that would give these new products, which might be a little bit more expensive in the production, and then also have impacts also on the retail side. So give those maybe an economic advantage, or provide some incentives also to shift towards that type of trade. So there are many options, I think, that can be explored.
That's great. And Patrick, when you work on these projects with partners from abroad, what is the understanding of the circular economy among them? For instance, you mentioned Bangladesh, but maybe there are other countries like India, maybe China, maybe some African countries. Do we have a mutual understanding of how we should handle circular economy? Or those countries, they understand circular economy as something that the Europeans or Americans want to implement?
Yes, both, yes and no. I mean, many countries already have circular practices because generally materials are used. Often waste products are then also repurposed, etc. So it's not something that Europe has invented. So circular practices are, you can find them everywhere around the world. And again, as I think I said in the beginning, actually, we have lost a lot of circularity that used to be maybe practiced in previous generation through like an industrial system that's designed in a way for fast turnover of products, high degrees of throughput of materials, and it's been described by actually Kenneth Boulding, an economist, back in the 60s, where he was saying we need to move away from a cowboy economy to a spaceship economy. And the way, so the cowboy economy is where you have a world that is basically, it's there, free for you to take. You might use violence to take resources, but they're generally available. However, now we need to move, and it's basically also an economy where there's less people, but more resources and environment. So I didn't explain that very well. But then the spaceship economy is more of a economy with thinking of the planet as a spaceship with a limited amount of resources, but also a limited amount of where you can put waste products, and also a lot more people on the spaceship that all need to have materials and products for to satisfy basic needs and provisioning systems. So this spaceship economy will require a lot more planning, and also, as mentioned before, considerations of how do we equitably share those resources. So also coming back to the question, how do different countries see this? I think in principle, most people get the idea quite easily. Then the big question is, how do we do this in practice? What are the specific measures that need to be put in place for specific sectors, for specific materials, and these can often look quite different. And there's also questions around, on the one hand, okay, how do we do this on the production side in terms of industrial manufacturing? What are the processes, etc. But it also relates to, in a way, how society relates to materials and products. And so the industrial linear model is so the social equivalent to that is consumerism. And so as countries shift on the industrialization path, it not only shifts the way products are made, but also shifts how people consume. So that's also, this transformation is not only a technical one, but also a social one. And that's again where many developing countries probably, they look at Europe and say, oh, but we're much more circular in our kind of practices compared to Europeans or even Americans, where there's a lot of, let's say, conspicuous consumption, overconsumption even in many aspects.
Yeah, I remember when I was 10 years old, and something around that age, when I bought a drink, the automatic thinking was to return a bottle at the times, Nowadays, when you buy a drink, you automatically think where I, trash, or where I put the empty bottle or plastic container to which bin, or where should I put it, So this is excellent point that you said, about thinking. Like, honestly, sometimes you can have all the technology in the world, but the thinking is making a big difference, like that automatic thinking about recycling to produce something that will last for 5 years instead of 5 months, and you can make it because we have the technology. But there is that effect, or that effect of money, that buy more. Like, honestly, sometimes when you read articles and people say, I have nothing to do, I go shopping. I don't need things, but I have nothing to do, I go shopping. So I buy more, I bring home more items, and then it's accumulating and accumulating. And when you reach like 40, 50 years old, and you are, that old, you have like full house of items. So I think this is big issue to try to promote also the thinking, not only the technical aspects of circular economy. But when we speak about shopping, let's go to other players in this, and that's the multinational corporations and companies. So, Patrick, do you think that we can create, or can we create any incentives for those actors so they can produce better and they can produce thinking about circular economy? Do those corporations care about circular economy?
Yes, depends which multinationals and which sectors. So there are some multinationals who are strong advocates of circularity, and they're also looking at circularity as their new innovation strategy. So they're doing it for different reasons. One of those is, as also mentioned before, supply chain security. So multinationals, they're normally also quite strategic. They're thinking ahead, more long term. So they can see that actually the supply of kind of primary materials is not viable in the long term as it has been in the past. So it becomes a strategy to think about, okay, how can we close the loop of the products that we sell, and how do we get them back so that we can use the resources, etc. So you can see that companies like IKEA, companies like Apple, Philips, and I mentioned Caterpillar in the past. So they're already using circular practices, and so that's encouraging. The question then becomes, okay, are these then closed loops which are under corporate control? So that's then a question again about access and right. If you close the loop within your corporate value chain, or how much do you involve other companies, other countries in this? So do you source your recycled materials from the open market, or is it within your, like, you can think you have a vertically integrated circular supply chain, which involves also the customers. So that's I don't think any company has done that yet, but you can think about it. This is a very efficient system. You have very little leakage from the environment perspective. It's good, but then again, that might be a scenario where the big players capture most of the economic value, and there's little opportunity for smaller companies. The other question then is obviously, does that model work in terms of increasing sales, right? Is that within a circular economy, is it possible to continue having this constant increase in product output, etc., etc.? Or do you need to think about, okay, how much do we want to grow as a company? Do we set a limit? And that's where I think something that Patagonia is doing is quite interesting, because they are considering some of these issues of how much actually should be produced, and so I think multinationals can do a lot. They're also working with their suppliers, but then obviously there's a whole lot of other multinationals which are based on a very linear system. If they like those companies that not do that or don't embark on this transformation on their own, they will need to be pushed by legislation. Actually, we see that I think most companies make these changes because it's policy driven. So that's again where, for example, European policy plays such an important role in driving this transformation. Obviously, in the policy process, it's important to involve all the stakeholders to make sure that any targets that are being set, any new standards that are being developed, also that it's possible to do that. Yeah, and then, as I said before, for example, in the case of Bangladesh, then it's not only about policies that are being set in Europe, but how do you then cooperate across with trading partners to make sure that kind of countries move together, that those countries which might need more kind of technical support or investment to make these changes are also supported.
Patrick, and do you know any bad example of implementing circular economy principles? For instance, that it looked promising, but then it went not as wanted. So we can maybe learn from that mistake or from that case study.
Yes, I wouldn't say bad examples, but there's many failed examples.
Okay.
I think you can see that probably in your city. Well, I've seen it here. So I mean, one of the big questions is, how do we shift to reuse models, right? Away from, this is now especially like a packaging issue. How do we and you can see reuse shops opening up but then closing again. And there was recently kind of like an article in The Guardian that I need to read again in more detail, but analyzing why reuse models have failed. So there are good examples, or even like business that have tried, but they haven't been successful, and we need to learn from these failures and think more about the reasons. There's other models which are stuck, I think, but like other than business, for example, there's also many. I think I'm going now towards more like better examples. It's like there's also social initiatives around. It's beginning to be like a real movement, repair cafes, that's really taking up around the world. So where you see also society wants to shift away from this model where things that are broken are just being replaced. But yeah, so there are failures. It's not all plain sailing.
Yeah, that's like, when you study PhD and you always have those from your failures, you learn the most. So
I guess so. Yeah.
Therefore I asked that question. Patrick, how what's the connection between the circular economy and economic growth? Can we redefine international economic growth based on circular economy? And what's the role of circular economy in that sort of calculation?
Right. Yeah, this is a big question that's often discussed. So there's the issue between green growth and degrowth. For example, you're probably aware of this. And yeah, in my and it's an open question because we need to see. So I'm for the circular economy. So the circular economy can help to decouple. So decoupling means there's relative decoupling, absolute decoupling. So decoupling aspect is basically generating economic growth with lower resource throughput and lower environmental impacts. So that can be relative, in terms of resource consumption and waste output grows at a slower rate than economic growth. That's the relative part. Or you completely decouple, right? That resource use declines and waste output declines. So that hasn't happened yet, but that's the objective, really. So the way this can happen is it cannot happen only through technology improvements. So it needs to be also through societal changes. So it's not only a technology transformation, but also a social transformation. And that's where it becomes really interesting to understand how circular business models can generate economic value. So that's also ongoing work. We need to think through how these new business models maybe not only generate economic value, but also social value in terms of better well-being. Also, how do they rebuild natural capital so that they have contribute positively to environment. So all of that is an open question that we need to pursue. So I'm generally optimistic about it. I think there's lots of potential, and what we need to avoid actually is to fall into these polarized debates, and we can see that happening quite often. So I see it more as also circularity as a way that can bridge like different camps who often entrenched. But again, how to make this work so we do need more circularity of materials. But again, it comes back to your question at the beginning: what's the objective? Right? What do we pursue it? Why do we use it? And so that's where then also the political context plays an important role. Right? Do we use circularity as a strategy for kind of more resource security, or in terms of competing with other countries to have control and access over resources, etc.? Or do we try to pursue that as a global transition, working collaboratively across, for human progress more generally, and trying to address also global environmental issues?
When you speak about circularity and the economy, I'm always thinking, what's about geopolitics and geopolitical risks? Because nowadays we read many stories about companies, and we often connect those stories to geopolitics. For instance, raw minerals, solar panels from China shipping to European Union, and similar cases. So what's about your research, and what sort of geopolitical risk can you associate with the circular economy? Or maybe to clarify that position for further research based on your experience.
So yeah, geopolitics makes this transition more complicated, because for several reasons. Obviously, geopolitical environment. Well, geopolitical environment is not conducive to international cooperation. That's one. So because, for example, we see geopolitics also playing out in fora on global environmental governance, for example. So that's where geopolitics also feed into that, where actually the international community needs to come together on and come to agreements on standards, for example, on like the plastics treaty, but other issues as well, how to on biodiversity, climate. On the other hand, I guess the geopolitics has maybe also brought circularity more to the forefront of kind of policy communities that haven't thought about it in the past, where we used to complain, oh, it's only the ministries of environment who are interested in the topic. But now we also see other ministries with remits also in security looking at this. So we have different critical raw material strategies, and many of these include mention of circular economy. So I think that's driven by geopolitical changes. There's even like kind of departments of defense looking at circular economy. How is that relevant for example, military equipment, etc., etc. So I think these are all changes that are driven by geopolitics, and it's probably helpful to accelerate the transition and drive new technology innovation. Yeah, I mean, when it comes to China, obviously there's economic competition on a lot of these things. So in a wider context, we consider renewable energy technology as part of the circular economy. So now we see that actually China is doing really well in production and manufacture at very low cost, which is on the one hand beneficial. Then recently, the last few days, there's kind of the announcement of new tariffs, for example, on Chinese EVs and other kind of low carbon technologies. All of that will probably delay the uptake and increase the costs for users. So, which has then implications also on carbon budgets, etc. So that's where the geopolitics and the more kind of protectionist trade aspects run counter to the objective of addressing global environmental challenges.
And what about if we turn this around? And for instance, we spoke about tariffs, we spoke about geopolitical implications, and now geopolitics from the West to the developing countries, Can we say that, do we encourage those countries to really think about circular economy?
Yes, so there's actually a lot of cooperation on circular economy happening. And as you said, a lot of smaller countries, especially European countries, have a lot of bilateral programs through their different development agencies. So we actually also involved in some of these, some of this work. Switzerland is doing work. The German GIZ is doing work. Europe, basically, this the DG INPA, DG International Partnerships, has circular economy programs that have been running for over 15 years already. And these kind of like are in many cases like technical assistance programs. So trying to work with partners in these countries, often like business associations or universities, and then working with different sectors and kind of small and medium-sized companies, especially. How do you upgrade equipment? How do you improve your energy efficiency? How can you implement material recovery? So many of these initiatives are underway. And I mean, there's also, in addition to that, so dialogues on policies, so sharing of experiences, what are good environmental policies that can be implemented. And so all of that is conducive to basically, I mean, working around the geopolitics in a way. I mean, with Europe and Africa, for example, I don't think it's necessarily geopolitics, but it's more of existing, I mean, it goes into the maybe more post-colonial discussions. So is the circular economy a new kind of neo-colonial way of, I mean, yeah, this goes also into the discussions around critical raw materials. There's a lot of discussions on that, and Europe has new partnerships signed with a number of countries, and the objective here is again, how do we make this work in a win-win situation? So how do we create added value also for the producer countries, or countries where extraction happens? So that's ongoing discussions.
When you promote circular economy, are there any ethical issues that you would recommend to think about when doing so?
Yeah, I mean, the ethical issues is around often informal sectors. So a lot of circular economy work involves informality, just for the reason that often the linear system just wants basically to get rid of waste. There's no value in it; it's a cost. However, there is value, and that value has been captured by in a way by often informal workers. It's not only waste pickers, but other smaller micro businesses involved in the handling or in the processing, etc., etc. So now, often the question is, now you have more formal businesses moving into this space who also now see the value in this, and want to access it. So then there's a potential competition over these secondary materials and resources. So these are ethical issues to consider, because there's always livelihoods connected, and you don't want to displace the livelihoods through a circular initiative that might be well-meaning but hasn't considered all the implications. So that's again where concepts of just transitions are really important. So what are the distributional outcomes? So what is distributive justice? What is procedural justice? So how do you involve kind of vulnerable stakeholders in the design of new policies, or if you change supply chains or value chains, and that requires more thinking and more involvement.
What about energy transition and the circular economy? I'm asking about this because sometimes I have a feeling that we have so many talks, webinars, and perhaps research papers about the energy transition. But as I said, I miss that sort of little element, how to connect the energy transition with a certain economy that is capable of financing it and also sustaining this. Because we're speaking about sustainable development goals. So if I implement something like renewable energy to a particular country, I want to sustain this energy. I want to, keep it just going and running. So based on your research, when you speak with the energy transition scholars and you speak about circular economy, how is this debate? What sort of topics are you speaking about? Maybe you can point to some topics that might be worth of researching.
Sure. I mean, there's different aspects. Often, and you're right, they're often not discussed together. But I would say you can't have an energy transition without a circular transition at the same time. So they are connected. Not only because, as I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of emissions coming from material extraction, processing, manufacturing, etc., in non-energy sectors. But then in the energy sector, like when you look at renewables, so there's two aspects. One is upstream, one is downstream. If we start with the downstream one, so the first generations of solar panels are now being decommissioned, and there's actually quite a lot of waste that's predicted to come through. So the current generation of solar panels hasn't been designed with circularity in mind. So they need to, they haven't been designed to be disassembled easily. So they need to be crushed. And then if you crush them, you can recover some of the materials like the silicon or the silver. Like the aluminium framing is probably easy, then the glass, etc. But there's new generations of solar panels being developed which are circular, basically, what means they're modular. All the different layers can be easily disassembled and reused. So it's a lot more resource efficient and doesn't create waste. So we will see a change, hopefully. But in the short to medium term, we see a big wave of solar PV waste coming through. That then also, I guess, goes to the question: you want to keep them going, because a lot of the renewable energy systems, they also need repair and maintenance. So in, for example, off-grid settings, what's been observed, there's a lot of like solar waste where you had small solar lanterns. They only work for 2-3 years or even less, and then they're just being discarded. So there's need not just for the kind of like diffusion of these, but there's also the need for service models, kind of the repair practices and all of that. Again, this requires that the products are also designed in a way they can be repaired, etc. And then you need people with the skills to be able to service and maintain this. This is similar with batteries, obviously. Batteries for the renewable energy system, if we look at EVs, for example, all of these materials will need to be recovered and recycled at some stage. So that's to prevent the renewable energy transformation creating a huge waste problem. But on the upstream side, as we're shifting from oil and gas and other fossil fuels, obviously the critical raw materials was mentioned. So there's a huge demand for new materials. Then again, so circularity will play a very big role in reducing the need for mining activities. So there are some estimates that through technology improvements, efficiency, and kind of circular solutions, I think we can reduce the demand of primary mining by something like 40%. So yeah, huge potentials for circularity, including at the mining sites themselves. So there are a lot of kind of like mining waste that's produced, tailings dams, etc. So which contain also large amounts of the materials that we need. So we need to develop the technologies that we can extract from mining waste. So that's another economic opportunity if you want to look at it that way.
Great. The last question for today's interview, Patrick. Can you tell us a few words about the projects that you're working on at the Chapman House, and maybe a few ideas for research for junior researchers or maybe some scholars that are watching? You know, where do you see that sort of areas where we might be helpful in terms to help to promote and to research circular economy?
Yeah, so one of the, so I mentioned we're working in some of the development cooperation programs of the European Union. So that's that's interesting work, and I think that could be an area also for researchers to look at how basically, how global development might be a vehicle to promote circular solutions. So if you're interested in development studies, that could be an area to look at. What we're also trying to do is, as I mentioned, there's this gap on international or multilateral level. So there's no global governance of the circular economy transition. So what type of institutions might be needed to facilitate an inclusive circular economy that brings benefits for human development, etc. So for that, one of our goals or plans is to launch a paper on what we call Circular Economy Futures 2050 at the next United Nations General Assembly, the UNGA meeting that takes place in September this year. It's called the Summit of the Future. So there are some high-level documents, for instance, that are being produced by governments, declarations for future generations, or the Pact for the Future, I think, is one of the documents. There's drafts available, but we haven't seen circular economy being mentioned in any of these. So it's, again, we're trying to raise maybe the awareness of these solutions at that level of the UN. Again, indicating that there's still basically a gap in understanding of what it is, what it can do, what's needed to accelerate the transformation. So we hope also to work more with the UN on these topics. Other areas of interest for IR researchers, I think, is probably this link how geopolitics and circular economy might interact. So one of the top, including also issues around, for example, protectionism and trade, whether this is beneficial or negative, what are the implications for the transition? So that could be, I think, interesting areas.
Patrick, thank you very much for your thoughts and remarks about this interesting topic. Before I was designing this episode, I was thinking circular economy, what we know, what students know, and I found that there is a bit simplicity or simplification of this topic, that usually people are thinking and speaking about the waste management. So I'm very happy that we clarify many aspects of circular economy. I think it's a very complex topic, actually. And I think there are many research areas, and also those ones that you mentioned, that might be interesting for some researchers. So again, thank you very much for your thoughts based on your experience, on your research. I'm very happy that we could record this, and I wish you good luck with all the further work, research, and we are looking for more papers, more thoughts to read about circular economy. Thank you for being on IR Thinker.